They attacked a human outpost. They had no idea who was stationed there. The heat spike hit the vacuum 3 seconds before the radar flinched. Four dark shapes tore through the static near the frozen rings, their jagged armor plates absorbing the thin light of the gas giant. They did not broadcast identity codes. They did not hail the perimeter. The heavy weapon bays on the lead hull slid open with a slow, hydraulic groan, locking their primary tracking lines directly onto the center of the command deck. I wish I could tell you they found a way out of that pocket. I would be lying. Stay exactly where you are. 6 hours before the first metal fell, the high command chamber on the capital world smelled of ionized copper and cold stone. The walls rose 80 meters into the dark, holding up holographic star maps that burned in a harsh crimson. High Commander Zyler stood at the center of the tactical dais, his four-scaled arms crossed behind his back. His eyes stayed fixed on a single amber dot on the screen labeled Outpost 41. It was an isolated human rock on the border, completely empty of orbital platforms or capital warships. The human presence in this sector is a simple mistake in the ledger, Zyler said, his lower arms twitching as he gestured toward the map. Their garrison has exactly 140 biosignatures. They have no shields, and their perimeter is a common wire fence. We will send 3 heavy cruisers and 28,000 ground troops to clear the grid. The collection will take less than 6 hours. Overseer Tikallon stepped out from the shadow of a basalt pillar, his gray skin dry like rust on iron. He had spent 3 centuries tracking the military history of the Outer Rim, collecting the names of groups the Empire tried to erase. He leaned over the dais, his voice dropping to a low whisper. Commander, the humans have stayed on that rock for 30 years without mining the valleys or patrolling the trade lanes. Have you asked why they chose a place with no value? They chose it because they are weak, and the Council allowed them to hide, Zyler said. He turned back to the main console and pressed a square black panel. The digital seal locked, sending the execution order down to the staging decks with a single stroke. Down on the surface of Outpost 41, a silicate gale howled across the gray plains, rattling the corrugated tin roof of the main mess hall. Inside, the air smelled of burnt toast and old grease. Commander Marcus Vance sat alone at a chipped plastic table, slowly stirring a mug of stale chicory coffee with an old metal spoon. He was 54 years old, his tight gray hair cropped close to a skull lined with thin, pale scars. He did not look at the windows, as the sky began to turn red with the heat of entering ships. Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked into the mess hall, her boots clicking softly on the metal floor plating. She held a black data slate in her right hand, her thumb resting on the power toggle. 3 cruisers just cleared the transition point, Commander. They are sending a standard Imperial clearance notice on all frequencies. They are giving us 5 minutes to lay down our tools and enter the sorting pens. Vance took a slow sip of the lukewarm coffee, his fingers remaining perfectly still against the white porcelain. Did the log name the officer in charge of the fleet? It is Zyler's Vanguard, Chen said, a faint, humorless smile showing at the corner of her mouth. The administrative reports listed this coordinate as an agricultural cooperative. They think we are growing tubers in the silt. Out in the main maintenance bay, Sergeant Jax Miller pulled the straps of his tactical boots tight, ignoring the dull throb in his cybernetic left knee. He picked up a heavy hydro wrench from his workbench, looking up through the reinforced viewport as the first wave of drop pods split the cloud layer. There was no shouting in the corridors. No one ran toward the auxiliary shuttles. The 140 residents of the outpost closed their logbooks, put down their tools, and walked toward the heavy steel armory lockers that had remained sealed for 3 decades. High Commander Zyler watched the atmospheric drop from the bridge of his flagship, waiting for the standard panic indicators to register on his terminal. The civilian settlement should have broken into scattered heat signatures within 2 minutes of the drop pod impact. Instead, the screen showed the human cluster remaining perfectly still inside their small wire perimeter. Zyler's tactical files did not contain the true name of the garrison. The Rock was not a colony. It was a restricted sanctuary charter established 30 years ago for the retirement of the Spectre Vanguard, the Black Ops strike units that had dismantled the Orion Syndicate during the border wars. The main tactical map suddenly split down the center as a yellow warning line flashed across the grid. The wire fence around the human compound did not collapse when the ground troops advanced. Instead, as 28,000 Imperial shock troops entered the narrow gap of the valley floor, Miller threw a manual lever inside the secondary bunker. The ground gave a deep, iron groan as 1,200 subterranean magnetic anchors surged to life beneath the silt, turning the entire valley into a heavy gravity well. The advance units have stopped moving, the tactical officer shouted from the lower deck, his hands hitting the console as the telemetry broke. Their heavy armor is pinned to the clay. The fields are pulling their plates into the dirt. Xyler stepped toward the edge of the dais, his upper hands gripping the rail until the metal casing cracked under his palms. Tell the secondary wave to deploy their kinetic shields and advance on foot. They are fighting old men with tools. They cannot uncouple the rigs, sir, the officer replied, his voice dropping into a flat, broken panic. The humans are opening buried trench lines under the rock. We are tracking 140 targets, but our casualty lines are moving too fast to log. We have lost 4,000 soldiers in 180 seconds. Vance stood in the forward trench, the cold gales throwing gray dust across his scarred cheeks. He held a heavy kinetic rifle with a worn wooden stock, a weapon banned by the Interstellar Council before Chen was born. He did not swing the barrel or shout orders into the comms line. He moved with the slow, steady rhythm of a factory hand working a double shift, his shoulder absorbing the rhythmic snap of the recoil as each round found the soft seals of the Imperial armor plates. Beside him, Chen kept her eyes on the digital layout, marking the flanking units with small clips of green light. The Imperial Vanguard was built for planetary intimidation, a massive wall of iron designed to break the will of civilian targets from orbit. It was completely useless against an army that lived beneath the bedrock and communicated through hardwired copper lines. At the 45-minute mark, the main flagship terminal began to broadcast a continuous heat warning from the outer system. 4 jagged black hulls slipped out from the shadow of the frozen rings, their massive kinetic rails already humming with cold power. They were the ghost ships of the Vanguard, vessels that did not exist on any council registry or diplomatic treaty. Protocol 88 had activated the exact second an Imperial boot touched the silicate planes of the outpost. Xyler looked at his monitors, his face turning the color of gray ash as he saw his 3 heavy cruisers boxed into a tight firing line by the very units his ledger had marked as retired. On the surface, Vance reached for the terminal toggle to accept the incoming transmission. Back in the grand basalt chamber of the High Command, the Crimson Star maps flickered 3 times and went dark, replaced by a low-resolution video stream from the border. T. Callan stood alone at the edge of the dais, watching the final recording return from the flagship bridge. There were no victory flags on the human screen. There was only the image of Commander Marcus Vance leaning against a rusted generator casing, his gray hair wet from the cold rain. The Empire had spent 9,000 years building monuments to its victories, measuring its survival by the number of names it could cross off its ledger. They had never learned what happens when you corner the men who built the ledger. As the transmission line began to fill with gray static, Vance's quiet voice echoed through the empty basalt columns, leaving a single line that would remain in the archive for 300 cycles. Vance set down his empty mug on the rusted plating, the cold porcelain clicking softly in the silence. He did not look back at the burning hulls in the sky. He walked toward the armory doors, his boots sinking an inch into the wet gray dirt.